Welcome back to part 2 of Terry's Enterprise D project. Right, so you can see that the saucer armature is pretty much done. I'm not planning on doing anything else to it. It's all there, it's all nice and strong. All of the major structural elements are there, and it's you can see I'm pressing down on it. It's all holding together really well, nice and strong and stable. So it's doing the job spot on. You might remember from the previous video that I mentioned that I'd have to bevel this, the leading edge or the outer edge of the saucer acrylic plates. You can see that those have been done. I did that with just an inch wide belt sander basically, and took my time and beveled away that edge there back by, I don't know, 15mm, 20mm, something like that. And as I said before, that was to allow the clamshell, like the saucer upper and lower halves, to close up onto each other, because the thickness of the acrylic would have prevented those parts from meeting up with each other and closing up properly. So as I said before, I knew that that was going to be an issue going in because of the thickness of the acrylic that we opted for these plates. So it wasn't a drama, and it was not really a big issue to get sorted out. So those parts fit nicely. You can see this area here where the neck meets the saucer itself. This is like the fundamental part of the whole armature, really. Next to like the post socket itself, this is the major load bearing structure right here. So it was really critical to get as much strength in there, but without introducing a lot of bulk, because you've actually got really low clearances and tolerances where the way that the ship is designed and the swoop of the neck, you don't have a lot of space here. And you would think with a larger sort of model like this, being 2 feet long, that you would get extra space, and yeah, you do get extra space, but then obviously being a bigger model, you need bigger elements in there because it's going to be heavy. So there's, you lose as much as you gain in that aspect. So it doesn't matter how big it gets, you always run out of room here. I ran out of room when I built the big 4-foot model for the National Film and Sci-Fi Museum. It was the same issue. I was struggling with space here. But that's just an element of the design of the ship more than anything else. So you can see that I've got 2 aluminium plates which basically sandwich the acrylic plate in between, because the acrylic, whilst being nice and clear and structurally stable, it's not actually that strong. You give it enough flexing and it will crack, it will break. Obviously don't want any risk of that. The way you get around that is you sandwich the acrylic between 2 pieces of stronger material, in this case aluminium plating, and you can see I've used all mechanical fasteners to lock it all together. So that is really strong and really stable, and will definitely stand the test of time. So just a quick word about drilling and tapping for those that may be interested. Obviously this acrylic is quite brittle, and you can cut threads into it, but they don't last very long. So what I've actually used are these little brass inserts. Hold on a sec, let me get the packet and I'll show you what I'm talking about. What I've got in my hand here is a brass threaded insert, and this particular one is what they call a heat setting insert. And the idea is that you drill a hole in the material that you want to insert this into, usually plastic, and then you heat this up with a soldering iron adapter, and you push it into that hole, and those knurls there melt through the plastic, and as the plastic sort of expands, it sets into those knurls, and once the plastic cools again, the insert is forever trapped inside whatever it is you've just seated it down into. So, well, unless the material around it breaks away, obviously. So there's a really quick and effective way of putting mechanical fasteners into thin material that you wouldn't normally be able to thread. So that's what I've done here. I've got a couple of different sizes of those. I've got the M3s in a lot of different positions around this saucer plate, and all of these parts here, they've got these M3, the 3mm M3 inserts everywhere where there is a screw terminating into the plate. And it's a really cost effective and fast way of doing it. With some of them, I'd heat setted it, but I've also backed them with a little bit of epoxy as well, just as a belts and braces thing. Doesn't need it, I would imagine, but I was mixing up epoxy for something else, and I just thought, well, I've got too much, so I'll bung it into the back of these. Can't hurt, right? So I did that. You can see right there, there's like a lump of steel epoxy putty, the steel enforced epoxy putty. That is just like a tie between the block and the spine here. To what I was finding was, as I was adding weight further and further forward, this was beginning to act a little bit like a spring, sort of. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to make me think that some of the seams around the neck might start to crack over time. If this was deflecting or, you know, giving a little bit of wiggle room, then the neck would have been taking the brunt of that, and you'd have started seeing failures around the seam. So putting that steel epoxy there and then tying it through straight down the spine through into this block that's locked that right tight, and it's really strong, and it's not going anywhere ever again, basically. The screw is acting like literally like a tie, and it's drilled down into this block, and it's tied this together with this acting as like a spacer block, basically. Right, so I think that pretty much covers it for the armature as it stands at the minute. So I'm going to get the rest of the casts assembled onto it, and we can see how it's all lining up. So I'll be back in a sec. Alright, so I've got the upper secondary hull part here. Ignore that, we'll come back to that. But you can see I've embedded a couple more of those brass thread inserts into the steel epoxy putty there. And that is to ensure that I get perfect alignment every time and a nice mechanical connection between the upper and the lower part. That was critical, particularly when I was trying to align all of the saucer armature to make sure that when the parts go together, that everything is straight and lines up. It's absolutely critical, because the parts alignment kind of guides the construction of the armature. In a perfect world, I would just build the armature from scratch without needing to reference the alignment of the parts, because everything would be square and perpendicular here, and I'd be able to assume certain measurements. We don't live in a perfect world, and even though these parts were originally 3D printed and 3D designed and all the rest of it, they were actually cast in rubber molds and resin, and things change. Some of the stuff is lost in translation, and when casts come out of molds, they invariably aren't perfectly true and straight. So there's always a little bit of give and take, and I'll come back onto that point a little bit more because it's a bit more apparent on the saucer. But so anyway, getting back to these screw threads, you can see there, I think I mentioned in the previous video about how thick these resin casts are. That's great because it gives, one, it's really strong as it is anyway, but two, it affords you opportunities to do this sort of thing where I can bury a screw head right into the resin there, and there's still plenty of meat left to give a really nice strong connection. So that's the idea there. You can see there's a couple of holes where originally I drilled further out towards the edge, thinking that would give me enough clearance in there, but actually it was too close to the edge. There wouldn't have been enough material, there wouldn't have been enough epoxy putty in there to have given me a nice strong sort of encapsulation for those threaded inserts. So just thought I'd bring that to your attention for those that were interested. I'll carry on putting this thing back together, and we'll see it all in one piece. Okay, quick word about alignment then. A few moments ago I was talking about, if we lived in a perfect world, it'd be a lot more straightforward to build these sorts of things, because you would be able to make certain assumptions between one thing and another and know that the result would be a reliable and true sort of reflection of what you're calculating. But with this sort of thing, that's just not the way it is. As I said, these parts, although they were 3D CAD designed and the masters were 3D printed, these casts came out of rubber molds. So and there's a lot of variables that create sort of distortions, and things get lost in translation slightly, as I've said before. So you have to kind of roll with that, and you rely on the parts to sort of guide your hand in terms of alignment anyway, because obviously when the model is finished, you're looking at the outside only. That's the important thing. So that's a roundabout way and long-winded way of saying that you have to give and take, and and sort of fudge it here and there, for lack of a better term. So that's what these things are on the saucer. This is the lower saucer part. So there's a couple of things going on here. These are plastic shims, and I'll come on to these in a bit when we assemble the saucer parts. But what I want to talk about mainly are these big splodges of epoxy putty. It looks like plasticine or clay, but it's actually rock hard. This stuff's, if you're not familiar with this stuff, a lot of people call it plumber's putty because plumbers use it, funnily enough. And it's basically steel enforced epoxy putty. It's got a steel powder content, and it makes it really strong, and it sets really fast. I love this stuff. It literally goes hard within a few minutes of mixing. So you have to work fast, but it's brilliant stuff. You've got a lot of options of different use cases for it, and I find it invaluable. I use it all the time, and this is a good example of where it can really help you. So it looks pretty ugly, there's no disguising that, but the intention behind these slugs is to create a repeatable and enforced alignment with this seam, this line here, the separation plane of the saucer with the neck along here. The way the parts are designed, they just sort of butt up to each other, and there's a gap. And if I wasn't to use any kind of backing or enforcement here, I would be left with a butt joint, sort of side by side only, which, you can make that work, but it is very difficult to make sure that the joint here is structurally stable, and therefore you don't run into issues of constantly chasing a moving target with the seam. Now, what I mean by that is, if this part is able to flex slightly, I mean, this is exaggerated, but if this part was able to flex slightly independent of the part butted up to it, like, adjacent to it, you would always get a witness mark. The seam would never go away. You probably would even end up starting to get cracks through the paintwork over time. And obviously I don't want that to happen. So what you need to do is bond these two parts together so they sort of lock together in place. And that's what this is doing. I'm taking a long time explaining this. I'll just show you. So basically what happens is the lower saucer part slides underneath this plate, and now these parts here are resting on top of the neck. So it's trapped the saucer like that. I've let go of it. It's not going anywhere. It's loose, but it's being held in place. And the main advantage of that, as I said, is it stops this part and this part sort of moving independently of each other, albeit very small amounts. You don't want that happening. So these are, once all this is fully assembled and finally assembled, these parts will be bonded together and they're reinforced with each other. So there'll be none of this earthquake kind of movement, and the seam will go away. Being fiberglass and wet layer, by the looks of it, he hasn't done like an infusion method or anything like that. These are hand layer parts. So with the best will in the world, you're never going to get absolute constant thickness of the part. you know, it's going to vary. You're going to get thick spots and thin spots, and actually you can see lumps and bumps where I've ground them away. You're never going to get a 100% consistent thickness around the part. You just never are. So what that means is that in certain spots there's going to be thicker and thinner parts, obviously, and where this is a known thickness and dead straight, there's going to be gaps and places where the parts don't quite match and fit properly to the armature. So that's where you need to add things like this. You need to put shims in here and there. One, to make sure you get good contact with the any armature structure you've got in there. But two, and more importantly, that they align with any adjoining or adjacent surfaces of other moulded parts, because where this won't be perfect, neither will this. So you need to kind of split the difference, and you can see where I've had to add little shims here and there in various places, and that is all to make sure that when the parts are all assembled and aligned together, there's minimal work required to make all of these joining planes match up with each other. If I didn't do all of this lot, the difference in thickness from this part to here would give us like a wavy line going, you know, if we were to look at it dead square. With, you know, if you have lumps and bumps on here, you would see sort of a wave, which you don't want to do. You know, it's a big scale buster, but it also would mean that it may not match up with the swooping curve going down this neck. So that's what those shims are for. I hope that makes sense. I probably didn't explain that very well, and I took a long time not explaining it very well, so I apologise if you don't get it. I'll perhaps sort of broach that subject again further down the line when we start to actually assemble this thing properly and finally. But I hope that kind of explains it anyway. So I'm going to put the rest of these screws in. As you've probably noticed, there are screw holes in various points. They're countersunk, so the idea being that, you know, a countersunk screw head like one of these would drop in, screw into one of these threaded brass inserts and disappear underneath the surface of the saucer part there. If the camera will focus, and then you just fill over the top of that, and you never know it's there. So I'm going to get this saucer part together and show you how it's all aligning and talk about next steps. Alright, the saucer parts are on there. Obviously I've just sort of clamped the upper part onto it for now. Just so you can get a bit of a better idea of how it's all lining up, and I think you'll agree that looks pretty nice and true, and minimal gaps, but pretty much what I was expecting. You know, you have to sort of expect these things with kits of this nature. You can see here, it's a little bit dark, but you can see that's a good example of where, even though these mastered parts would have been, like I keep saying, they would have been done in CAD, 3D printed, you'd expect that these parts here, this joint, would be perfectly straight and level and would go together a dream. But you can see that during the moulding and casting process, and probably maybe even the printing process itself of the masters, there has been, you know, something has changed slightly. You know, one isn't perfectly straight, or neither are probably perfectly straight. So there you go. That's the sort of thing that you run into with these sorts of projects. Yeah, granted, you probably can't see it very well. It's really hard to see it on the material while it, you know, until it's been primed. But that separation plane, they align really nicely, as well as you could possibly expect. And considering none of these parts are glued together, they're literally being held together by the armature and the way that they've bolted to the armature. So if they're holding together this well while they were sort of dry fit, so to speak, then when I actually start bonding them together and cinching them up tight, it's going to get even better. There is a ever so slight lip there. I can feel it with the edge of my fingernail, but nothing that a couple of swipes of sandpaper won't take care of, and it will just look like the separation plane, because obviously there needs to be a line there, because there is on like the real ship sort of thing. So the seam doesn't need to go away entirely, it just needs to not look like a massive gap and misalignment. So yeah, really happy with that. So let's talk about next steps then. So what's next? Well, now the armature is basically done, I need to start looking at, one, accuracy of like the parts and like the major features, and two, the exposed panel details from Picard season 3, all of those exposed greebly details. So in terms of accuracy, the kit is pretty good actually. I'm happy with it accuracy wise for the most part, but I found that the main impulse engine as supplied was just way too thin. It was too skinny across its width there, so or rather across its height. So I've printed like a new master. I created a new part in CAD, mould and cast it in translucent resin, and it's much more accurate. Again, it's tough to tell while the material is sort of all the same colour and translucent, but the main shape now is much more accurate to the like the way it's seen on screen. So obviously I've had to cut a massive hole to allow my new part to go in there. That'll all be dealt with in due course, but the position and the shape and the size, it's all a lot better, so it's a lot more accurate, so that's pretty good. I've already drilled out all of the positions for the marker lights. You can sort of see where I've ground into the part there. I've created like a big sort of cavern underneath there, and then drilled the appropriate places. I'll just probably end up putting a singular sort of neutral white LED in here, and then putting coloured fibre optic strands in there for the reds, greens and the whites. Top and bottom, bit tricky because obviously that the part was cast completely solid in that point, so I needed to create enough space to, one, fit an LED, and two, channels to get the fibre optics into there. The next major clear up that I need to tackle, and this is going to be really tough to get the camera to pick it out, but the sensor band recess along the edge of the saucer is in a pretty bad shape on this particular cast. This is obviously one of the last ones to come out of Don's moulds, because I'm really not gonna be able to show this very well, but basically where there should be a recessed, a nice recessed sort of band here, there's just lots and lots of chunks where the rubber of the mould has torn out in previous cast pulls, left big holes in the rubber, and then as he's gone and cast subsequent parts, obviously the resin has filled in those holes in the rubber, so that recess basically isn't a recess anymore. It's like a rocky canyon now, and it all needs to be cleared out and done pretty cleanly and evenly. So with the best will in the world, I'm never going to be able to get that cleaned out, like consistently and accurately by hand. I need to create a way of getting that cleaned out accurately and consistently and quickly and reliably. So let me show you what I've come up with, and don't laugh. Right, so to clear out a nice consistent amount of material without varying the amount of depth and sort of position and all the rest of it, this is what I've come up with. This is like a poor man's CNC routing table. Obviously it's upside down at the minute. Well, I say obviously, I know it is. Let me explain. So basically I've got this router attachment on my Dremel. There's a milling bit in the end of the Dremel, and I've cut a slot into this chipboard, and at the moment that is poking through the slot. You'll see that in a second. And basically what I've done is I've glued these tongue depressors either side of this to create a really basic slideway to make sure that I've got adjustability for the position of the milling bit sort of forward and back, and make sure I can lock it in place. So very crude but it works. So let me just get this thing turned over, and then you can see like the business end of it, and you'll probably get a better idea of how it works. Okay, again, really crude, but it does work. So what you've got then is a really badly cut slot in the chipboard, and then that routing bit, or like the milling bit, protruding up through it. So obviously on the Dremel itself, you've got the adjustment for the height here. You just, you can adjust how high the milling bit protrudes up out of that slot, and because of that really crude slideway there, I can adjust the position like forward and back through that slot. So those brass pins are glued in place, so they act as my like guide stops, and the idea being that you rest the workpiece edge, in this case the saucer rim, against those pins, and you set that milling bit to a position where it's cutting that material. Obviously I'll set it a little bit better when I come to actually do this, but I think you get the idea of where I'm going with this. So as the bit is turning and I'm sliding the saucer part along, it's going to clear all that material out in a really consistent manner. It's not going to go, I'm not going to start cutting into the saucer in this direction too far. I'm not going to start getting too much depth and blowing through the edge of the windows. Nothing like that. I should get a really, really clean and consistent recess back. So that's what I'm going to do. It should work really well. I'm going to test it obviously before I do it. Make sure it doesn't all shake itself apart and ruin my saucer part. But I think it'll work really well. So yeah, let me know what you think about that. Like I said, it's really crude, but I think it's the fastest and most sort of consistent way I can get that done. Because like I said, with the best will in the world, I'm never going to be able to do it by hand. Could probably do it with a knife and files and sandpaper. It would take hours and hours and hours and hours, and I'll probably never get it as clean as doing it this way. So, but yeah, we'll see how that goes. So, as for the rest of it, obviously that major cleanup is yet to come, and then I'm going to start sort of plotting out masks, because although it might seem like I'm sort of jumping ahead a little bit, what I need are really accurate sort of positions for all of the open panels that you can see on the show. And those are really sort of locked into the whole plating. So I need to know where the whole plating is going before I know where to cut open all of the openings. So I need the masks. So yeah, a little bit sort of cart before the horse to get that done, but there we are. So that's going to be my next sort of major hurdle, is upscaling my 1400 scale masks and recontouring them so they'll fit this kit, and then I can start cutting in and developing those inserted greebly panel details. So that's enough waffling from me for now. I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.